G. Agus Fáilte. Hello and welcome to Let's Talk US Politics. I'm Andrée Murphy and I'm your host for this evening. The one positive thing about our pandemic has been it's afforded us an opportunity to engage in conversations with people who are from across the globe on issues of mutual interest. And this evening is no different. We're absolutely delighted that we are able to have a conversation about something that we're all engaged in and talking about, the US election a fortnight from tonight. And we're going to have four very esteemed contributors that we normally wouldn't be able to have in West Belfast or even on the island of Ireland together at one time. And so it's my pleasure to be able to introduce the panel for tonight. This election is the campaign of a generation, set with the background of COVID, Black Lives Matter, and a new form of American politics. We'll have plenty of discussion to have this evening. Suzanne Lynch is the Washington correspondent for the Irish Times, formerly their European correspondent, and she brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to her pieces, including only last Saturday's, giving us on this side of the ocean an important insight into what's happening on the ground during this campaign. Niall Stanage is the White House columnist and associate editor for The Hill in Washington, D.C. He's a regular contributor to TV and radio on both sides of the Atlantic, including MSNBC, BBC, Sky News, and of course, RTE. A native of Belfast, he's lived and worked in the United States since 2003, and he's also the author of an Irish bestseller about Barack Obama's 2008 campaign for the presidency of the US, Redemption Song. Deirdre Feerick is the Senior Legal Director of New York's Industrial Transportation Union and has very strong connections to West Belfast and with our own James Connolly Centre, and she's very welcome tonight. She's also the former district leader for Queen's Democratic Party. Niall O'Dowd will be well known as a key voice for Irish America in our peace process. He was a founder of irishcentral.com, which gives us much information, and a founder of the Irish Voice and Irish America magazine. And there's no doubt that his own journey through the political landscape of Irish America during our peace process has made him a regular voice and face for all of us. So you're all very, very welcome this evening, and thanks so much for giving your time to this. I want to start by maybe getting contributions from you all around the backdrop to this campaign. That kind of seems like a difficult question because it seems like there's always a campaign happening in America. But, you know, for this, what are the key issues that you've identified and what do you think will be the deciders for voters in a fortnight? I'm going to start with Deirdre and then work our way through.
I think that during this campaign, I mean, during COVID, this is a very strange time for people campaigning, how they're being touched, traditionally, you know, we would go to a state that we would try to pull the people out. We would volunteer, get on buses, go knock on doors. That's different this time. You're not knocking on doors. You're contacting people through internet, through phones. You're trying to make sure that people are going to come out. I think that there has been almost like an inundation with different ads and different information. Talking to people on the phone, I feel like some people have made their mind up. It's going to be hard to try and change minds, but we're trying if there are people that we still want to pull. But it really is about activating your base, making sure that people come out. And now they don't have to come out. They can vote at their kitchen table. And that really is a big change, that you're having people being able to vote. That is a very different type of process. And it is, you know, you're going into someone's living room on the phone while you're talking to them, going through the ballot, talking to them about different things. And that is a strange, different, but it's probably going to be the new way that we're going to be getting people to vote. I think the most important thing is how we're going to recover and who has a plan for recovery, how we're going to build back the country's economy. And I think that that is really what people are going to be voting with their purses. They're going to be looking at what is going to work for them. I think there is a fear to a certain degree about what the unknown is, and that also comes into play. There's a lot of, you know, different factors in this election that there ever have been before, but we need to, people are definitely paying attention, and I'm hoping that the numbers are what they say and that they're going to go through the roof, and it is going to show more people getting involved, paying attention, and really building for the future, and that maybe that is a good thing to come out of this horrible pandemic.
Neil O'Dowd, what were your own thoughts about the backdrop to this campaign? Is it different to previous campaigns? Is this the once in the generation type of election?
I think it's profoundly different. I think it puts together this concept that you're looking at two Americas. If Joe Biden is re-elected, you go back to some semblance of sanity, international cooperation, reasonableness in political discourse. If you elect Donald Trump, I think he's already said what he's going to do, part of which will be trying to jail his opponents. He's already talked about putting Obama in jail and trying to put Biden himself in jail. And you think this is a joke and you think it's funny, and then you realize he actually means this thing. And he's proven that by the fact that he was so vindictive against everybody who ran against him the last time. He's still harping on about Hillary. This is a guy who wants to be a dictator. This is a guy who looks around the world and sees Putin, and he sees the guy in Brazil, and he sees that kind of style of tin pot dictator is very attractive to him. So I think it's an existential election in that America, I think, sleepwalked into Donald Trump. I don't think 4 years ago the economy was good. Hillary was deeply disliked. There was a kind of well, let's give this strange guy a shot. If America re-elects him, it says a dreadful thing about America. If they don't re-elect him, we can look on it as a mistake, a historical mistake. But I do believe that, in the next 4 years will be so critical in America. If they re-elect Donald Trump, I really fear for liberal democracy.
Okay. Suzanne, your own thoughts on what Deirdre and Neil have said, but also maybe something about the differences between Biden and Trump in responding to those big issues that have been the backdrop, the COVID, maybe the Black Lives Matter kind of background of the summer that we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that this is a different election because I think it's about one thing, and that's about Donald Trump. That's why people are voting this time. I mean, people use the phrase all the time, it's the economy, stupid. I don't think that's really the case this time. I think people are voting either because they love Donald Trump and they want more of him, or they despise him and they want him out. So, a lot of the Joe Biden vote, being honest, is just the fact that he is not Donald Trump and he is an alternative. And of course, Biden as a candidate, I think, is the right man for the moment. He's got all the characteristics that Donald Trump doesn't have. He's got political experience. He's got empathy. He has got a huge foreign policy experience in particular, had worked very closely with a lot of traditional US allies around the world while he was vice president. So there are issues that are a backdrop here. But I would say I think Trump is the predominant issue. In saying that, in terms of COVID, obviously Donald Trump completely squandered a chance to turn around that story. Polls show that even among people who support Donald Trump, more people do not approve of his handling of COVID. So rather than kind of saying mea culpa, look, I experienced COVID, I feel everyone's pain, he instead doubled down on his kind of denialism about COVID and kind of said, oh, what's the big deal? And completely expanded that empathy gap that he has with ordinary Americans. So I think that could really be his downfall. The other issue, the George Floyd protests, like that works two ways. I was recently, a few weeks ago now, in places like Wisconsin and Minneapolis, where the George Floyd killing happened, and it's pretty shocking to be there. But Trump's message of law and order does resonate with some people in those communities. I talked to a lot of women in their 60s from like Wisconsin who are like, no, we don't want this. They were showing me were burnt out cars and a lot of protests that erupted after the initial protests. And, Trump is banking on getting that vote out. Now, polls are suggesting it may not work for him, but I suppose we can't discount the people who voted for Donald Trump. They're still out there. They still like him. And that team might work well. But as I say, my overriding view is that it's just all about Trump, and if you love him or hate him or not.
Would you agree with that, Niall? And do you think that, the picture that we get on this side of the ocean from RTE and BBC of it being a very extremist, polarized type of vote, do you think that's an accurate reflection?
I do, actually. And I would reiterate what both Neil and Suzanne have said. The question in this election is, Donald Trump, yes or no? Do you want 4 more years of Donald Trump? It is not the case that we can any longer pretend or believe that this is a sort of disruptor who, once he gets into power, will hew toward the center or will adopt a more modulated approach. We know who Donald Trump is at this point. Many people would argue we knew who he was 4 years ago, but it is now beyond dispute. And the vision of America that he puts forth is so different and aberrational from what we have seen before. If you think of the negative or toxic currents in American life, Donald Trump has inflamed almost every one of them. Racism, sexism, xenophobia, anti-intellectualism, and a whole host of other problematic things. Now, to your point, Andrée, about the polarized electorate, and Susan alluded to this, there is about 30 to 35% of the American electorate that love Donald Trump, are absolutely unshakable in their support for him. There is then, depending on what poll you look at, I don't know, 10% at most, who are, in my view, and this is reflected in the polling, conservatives who don't really care for Donald Trump's demeanor or approach, but are willing to hold their noses and vote for him because of his capacity to attain conservative goals. We might talk about Amy Coney Barrett, for example, the nominee to the Supreme Court. Having evaluated or enumerated those people, there is then, in one poll recently, 47% of the population say they won't vote for Donald Trump under any circumstances. There just isn't the thing that we would have seen even going back to the early 90s with candidates like Bill Clinton. Clinton talked about the vital center and reaching out to the center ground. The center ground in American politics and in American public life has, I mean, it has been narrowing, I think, for decades, but it has got vanishingly narrow during Donald Trump's presidency, in my view.
And I think we'll come back to that and to the whole issue of bipartisanship and Biden, particularly in that. But what I want to do first is maybe talk about, you hinted there, Niall, about the polling. So we see national polling statistics coming and putting Biden kind of, you know, in a fairly comfortable position. But it's different in the Electoral College and in key states. Isn't that the case, Suzanne?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's important to just emphasize again, you know, this electoral college system is, and it means that, you know, at the moment, Joe Biden is leading by up to double digits in national polls. But the reality is that he could win the popular vote by a much bigger margin than Hillary Clinton and still lose the election, because it comes down to a few key states. Each state gets a certain amount of electoral college votes. So you need to win these states in the middle that swing between Republican and Democrat. So that's why at the moment as we speak here, we're seeing the candidates focusing on those states: Pennsylvania, Florida, Michigan, Arizona. There could be up to maybe 8-10 states that, you know, are tight enough. And I suppose it's interesting, this weekend just gone, the Joe Biden campaign did put out a note to supporters, kind of trying to dampening expectations and say, look, our polling is showing it's tighter than you may think. I think they're getting worried now that complacency is going to set in because Biden is ahead in the polls. But his lead is much tighter in these key states. So they're worried there about turnout, and they're trying to keep their supporters engaged, get the numbers out to vote. You see that, you know, one of the many trends we can see in American politics, as we saw in places like in Britain with the Brexit election, is this rural-urban divide. So some of those states I just mentioned there, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, you see, if you look at the map, you see the blue around the cities. So in Pennsylvania, around Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but the rest of the state, rural Pennsylvania, is pro-Trump. The same is in Wisconsin, which I mentioned. You know, the cities are Democrat, the inner city, but the suburbs tend to be more Republican, and then the countryside does as well. So really, look, all politics is local, and you know, we can talk all we like about the state for Donald Trump that's out there. But if more people in New York vote for Joe Biden than Donald Trump, that makes no difference. It's about the people who vote in these key swing states. And that's why, as I say, those candidates are focusing there at the moment.
Deirdre, you'll have a bit of an insight in terms of how the unions are and in terms of that idea that the Rust Belt voted for Trump the last time because there was that sense of the economy, the working person having felt alienated from the political system. Do you see anything different this time, or a different type of mobilization?
Well, first off, I agree with Suzanne. I think Biden is working for every vote, and I don't think he's relenting. I think he's continuing to fight for every vote. And in Pennsylvania, when Trump that night, it was like a gut punch. I mean, that is a union. Those are union households. But we were calling into union households, and we were trying to make it clear that it was all about the Supreme Court. And we were right. The decisions that came out of the Supreme Court hurting labor, hurting working people, is exactly what was predicted. And I think that now we've been hammering home. TWU does phone banks, unions doing phone banks, not just to our members. We're going outside, we're going into other states, and we are targeting union households to make sure that they come out and they vote, in particular on the states that Suzanne was mentioning. I mean, Arizona's at play. We have a number of states, Pennsylvania. I mean, that should go Biden, but nothing is being taken for granted. We're still hitting it. And we have to make it clear that this is still about the Supreme Court, and it's also about, how we're going to protect our workers. And, right to work is really right to die or right to starve. And we have to call it what it is and make sure that we hammer that home as we continue.
Absolutely. There's a real sense that the polls got it wrong the last time, Niall, and there was, that people thought that Hillary Clinton was home and dry even on the day of the vote, and it didn't go that way. Have any lessons been learned in terms of that?
Don't trust polls. I think, the shy Trump vote is what scares me the most. That there's 2 to 3% of people out there who will not admit that they're voting for Donald Trump. Now, if that is a 2 to 3% number, it makes those swing states that Suzanne and Niall were talking about incredibly important, because Biden is roughly leading by 6 points in as an average, perhaps. So I think it could be very tight. I really worry about the shy Trump vote, because I live in a middle-class neighborhood of Long Island, and just personal experience, there's an awful lot of people who did very well out of Donald Trump. There's an awful lot of rich people who got a hell of a lot richer. There's an awful lot of Irish Americans I know who are voting for Donald Trump because of their taxes. They don't take into account the things that we take into account. So I think there is reason for concern. Having said that, I think Biden is the perfect Trump slayer, in the sense that people like him instinctively. They didn't like Hillary for some reason. They like Biden instinctively, and he doesn't raise the same hackles as Hillary did. And I think that's what he really has going for him. But I certainly would agree with everyone else that I get up every morning, read the polls, and wish fervently that they're true. But to be honest, I got such a shock in 2016. I could never be as confident again.
I'm sure. Niall, when you're looking at those number crunchers and looking at the states, and we're maybe staying up overnight on the 3rd of November, where should we be looking?
Well, let me firstly add a caveat to what other people have said, because it has become a commonly held belief that the polls were all wrong in 2016. The national polls were fairly accurate in 2016. They came within roughly a point of predicting Hillary Clinton's popular vote win. What were wrong, catastrophically so from a Democratic perspective, were the polls in swing states, and particularly in the upper Midwest, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, the 3 crucial states that Donald Trump won in that region. There is a whole other argument that we could get into the minutiae of about whether pollsters were undersampling people without college educations, for example, which tends to be quite a Trump supporting group. But I just wanted to offer that corrective, so to speak, on the polling question. Where we should be looking at, Florida is the largest and therefore most important swing state. If Donald Trump loses Florida, it's very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to see a pathway to victory for him. Those other 3 states that I mentioned, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, are also really vitally important. I don't want to sort of get us off too much in a digression, but a health warning, if you like, about the results in Pennsylvania particularly. We haven't spoken yet, and we may do in what's left of the discussion, about the importance of mail-in voting, voting by post in this election. Pennsylvania allows postal voting, but does not allow those votes to begin being counted until election night. That means that unlike the election night in America that we're all used to, where you get a projection of a winner often within hours of the polls closing, that may not be the case this time. You could quite easily be looking at days, hopefully not weeks, but you could be looking at days, particularly in the event of a close election, before we know the result. There is, of course, another rather ominous element to that picture, which is that President Trump has for months been casting aspersions on the integrity of postal voting, has been suggesting that the only way he can lose this election is through fraud if it is stolen from him. There's not, in fact, evidence of widespread fraud, either in person or by mail. But if we have a very close election where the result does not become clear for several days, and Donald Trump is in the White House pumping up his supporters about fraud, you could be in a very ominous situation, I think.
That's really interesting, and something we'd understand here, I think. I want to talk about this idea of an Irish American vote and what that might look like and what influence that might have on the vote. Donald Trump's administration has been quite noticeable by the number of Irish names that he's had around key areas and places that are there. And Niall, you spoke a little bit about how you know Irish Americans who are voting for him because they feel Trump is good to them. But I'm interested in, is there something that's mobilized? Is it an actual vote that you can look at? And the difference between maybe people who are voting who call themselves Irish American and the people who are sitting in the Congress who call themselves Irish American. And I'm going to come around to all of you around that. But I'll start with you, Niall, around what are Irish Americans doing at the minute and where are they mobilized, if at all?
The Biden people have paid quite a lot of attention to Irish Americans. There's an organization called Irish Americans for Biden that will be holding tomorrow night their 6th event, trying to get Irish Americans to work for and vote for Joe Biden. And that's really been at the instigation of the candidate himself, who has made it very clear. And it's an interesting point about Biden. He didn't have to make himself an Irish American politician. The name Biden is not Irish. He could have easily got by and said, I'm a WASP, I'm an Anglo-Saxon, whatever. But he very specifically picked his identity and he very specifically refers to it, even in the first debate. I'm an Irish Catholic from Pennsylvania. Everybody recognizes that kind of almost throwback politician that Biden represents. But I'll tell you the difference between the Biden campaign and the Hillary campaign. With the Hillary campaign, the Irish American lobby could not get beyond the computer geniuses who were slicing and dicing and did not pay attention to ethnicity, and it's particularly burnt them in Pennsylvania and states where there was large numbers of Irish Americans. And we had huge difficulty with Hillary. We didn't hold one single event. But with Biden, it's been an absolute open door. And I know not just with the Irish, but with lots of other ethnic groups, where they very specifically, they're beaming an event into Ohio tomorrow night. They're beaming an event into Pennsylvania. We're doing a get out to vote tomorrow night, which we think we'll get about 1,500 people on Zoom to start making calls. So there's been a very clear commitment from the Biden campaign. And if you notice at the weekend, I know Suzanne reported this, there was a statement from the Biden campaign saying, I'm here for the Irish Americans. I'm going to deal with the issue of immigration, the issue of the Good Friday Agreement, and the issue of Brexit. Now, that would never have come out of the Hillary campaign because they just were not focused in the ethnic direction. So to summarize, I think there is a specific group of Irish Americans who have been drawn into the Biden circle who are pushing very hard because you're talking about states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, with large Irish American populations. The very clever part of this is that the Biden people see it And it's the first time I've seen a candidate going back to Clinton who actually sees it as a practical thing to do to try and bring Irish America into the frame. And I think Biden has succeeded in doing that.
Suzanne, you did report on that piece by Joe Biden, which kind of coalesces some of the moves that have been made by, say, the Friends of Ireland in the Congress and statements before with the Ways and Means Committee, you know, those issues around Brexit and around the integrity of the Good Friday Agreement. Do you think, first of all, it makes any difference to voters in America? It makes a difference to us because we feel valued and noticed, but does it make a difference to voters in America?
Well, no, look, I mean, American voters are not going to be voting on foreign policy in this election, I don't think. That's always been the case. But look, it's undoubted that this intervention by senior members of Congress on the Brexit issue has been very notable. I arrived here just under 4 years ago and nobody was talking about Northern Ireland or the Good Friday Agreement. Then we had the 20th anniversary and there were lots of events here and you know, it kind of got back on the agenda all of a sudden. I felt people were talking about it again and Americans were taking great pride in it because there was a lot of events around St. Patrick's Day that year. And then when Brexit happened, all of a sudden it reignited the issue and we saw senior people on Capitol Hill taking an interest. So people like Richard Neal, the chairs of the Ways and Means Committee, that was a crucial moment. You know, Democrats won back control of the House of Representatives in November 2018. The Congress then sat in January 2019. And Richard Neal was appointed to this very senior trade role. So that took everyone by surprise. You know, the British Embassy here, as much as the Irish Embassy, no one knew he was going to get the senior job. But all of a sudden, he's now the man who can sign off effectively on trade deals. Ultimately, they're the arbiters of that. And we also have some Irish Americans on that committee, the Ways and Means Committee. We've Brendan Boyle, we've Dan, what's the guy, his name escapes me from, who I've interviewed. Yes, Dan up from Flint, Michigan. You know, they're all on that committee. And these people, you know, they read the Irish Times every day. They know what's happening. They know the detail. So undoubtedly, they've got the back of Ireland on this. I just would say though, and Nancy Pelosi, you know, in one way, it doesn't even matter if Joe Biden gets in because Congress is the most important point here because Richard Neal and Nancy Pelosi, and we presume they're both going to be back in their roles in January, you know, they have the final sign off. In saying that, I would say to people, and, you know, I'm including myself here in the coverage that maybe I was a bit, you know, black and white about this. You know, there's nuance here. You know, we can't underestimate, like, you know, Britain is a very important ally of the United States. The special relationship is very strong. And militarily, it's a big ally in terms of defense and military. Obviously, Ireland doesn't fulfill that role at all. So, you know, we can't just say, oh, well, sure, Irish Americans don't care about Britain. That's not the case. And Richard Neal, I'm sure if he's here, would say, look, ultimately, you know, I would like, America does want a trade deal with Britain. Now, aside from the fact that trade deals anyway, every trade deal takes years, you know, they've got a lot of mountains to climb, regardless of the Good Friday Agreement. But what they have said is they've really put down, you know, the line and said that if they are not happy with how Brexit affects Northern Ireland, they're not going to do it. So Britain is in a bind on that. But I suppose just to step back a bit, you know, we are of the moment now, like where this Brexit issue, we're really in a tense moment with Brexit. But, you know, 4, 5, 6 years down the line, this trade deal could still be in the pipelines. And I suppose not to forget, you know, there is a commitment by America to Britain as well as Ireland. So that will be the kind of challenge for Joe Biden and a lot of the politicians. Mick Mulvaney and the Trump administration have been quite good on this. They've said things like, you know, they're pro-Brexit, they're anti the European Union. Trump does not like the European Union. He's a big Boris Johnson supporter. So of course they think Britain are right to leave. But they've been quite clever at saying, look, it's not our job to question, you know, the decision. We're not trying to play one side off the other and try to take, you know, we're keeping an eye on peace in Northern Ireland, but we also respect Britain's right to leave the European Union. So, but look, it's been there's no doubt about it, it's been a very, very good boost for Ireland in these negotiations when it's entering such a crucial phase between Brussels and London.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's had a massive impact here, I think probably more than any sort of policy has done in a very, very long time, perhaps since the interventions around the peace process. Niall, I'm interested in your own thoughts around this. You know, there is something we need to keep our eye on as well, because there are other elections happening at the same time as this big national one that is going to have an impact on whether this big statement by Joe Biden, should he be elected, will be able to be stood over if the complexion of Congress was to change?
There is. I mean, I guess we're at the part of the discussion where I declare my heresies, right? And we might burn me at the stake afterwards or whatever. But look, this whole idea of the importance of an Irish American vote, Niall and I have disagreements on this, and that's fine. That's one can have civil disagreements. I don't believe there is an Irish American vote in this country anymore. I do not believe there are distinguishing features to the Irish American community that make it politically different from other white ethnic communities. And I understand what happens in the Irish media and elsewhere, that there is, of course, a natural interest, as there is in this discussion, in just talking about the importance of Ireland. But it is also important to notice or to note that there are other ways in which we don't want to give an illusory impression of the importance of Irish America in American politics. People talk, understandably, about, for example, the importance of Irish Americans in some of those swing states in the upper Midwest. The biggest ethnic group in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin is German Americans. Who among us ever has read a piece or would consider pitching a piece about the German American vote? And the reason we wouldn't do that is because it is, as I say, indistinguishable from the white ethnic vote. Irish Americans will vote on their ideological outlook, and the demographic determinants of that vote will be things like education, religiosity or lack of it, social class, social mores, all of those kind of things. And we can look through all of these issues. Immigration is a commonly cited one. When it comes to undocumented or illegal or whatever term you want to use, immigrants in the United States, Irish numbers are around about 20,000. There are, according to the Migration Policy Institute, 11.3 million undocumented immigrants in this country. And people say, well, the Irish aren't as important as, say, the Mexicans, which is certainly true. There are about 6 million Mexicans undocumented in this country. But here, bear in mind the 20,000 Irish figure. There are, and again citing the Migration Policy Institute here, 655,000 unauthorized immigrants from El Salvador, 525,000 from Guatemala, 355,000 from Honduras. That means that for every undocumented Irish person in this country, there are about 18 Hondurans. Now, that is not to belittle the importance of immigration to those Irish people or to those Honduran people for that matter. But I sometimes think that the nature of the dynamic of reporting so much on Irish issues actually gives a misleading impression to people in Ireland about the centrality of these issues to the American debate.
Yeah, but Niall, I don't think you can disagree that without Irish America, Bill Clinton would never have taken up the Irish cause.
Sorry, go ahead, Niall.
Taking up the Irish cause was central to the Irish peace process and showed, I agree with you that in the broadest sense, there is no Irish America. But if you're looking at the difference of Joe Biden being president, pissing off the British government, getting in their face, I think that's a very important thing. As I thought way back in the early 90s when a group of Irish Americans approached then candidate Clinton, I agree with you in the broadest macro sense, but I think in the narrow sense of can we influence American foreign policy, most definitely. I think that's an important point to make.
Yeah, and I don't actually disagree, and I don't want us to derail the entire conversation with this, but I do actually agree, and I take that point, Niall, that you and others were very important in that phase of the peace process. I also think you might agree with me that Irish people in Ireland and Irish Americans need to work out how that relationship, even at the political Washington level, is going to be characterized going forward, because you have people like Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi who are not just sort of old school politician in the broad sense, but who are generationally people who remember very much the troubles, the conflict in Ireland, all of that. I happened to look up in the process of doing that the ages of people when the IRA first called it ceasefire. Biden and Pelosi were in their 50s. Trump was in his late 40s. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was 4 when the IRA called its first ceasefire. That means, I think, that the future of the Democratic Party is generationally going to shift and is going to resemble people like AOC more so than the old school Pauls like Joe Biden. And I do think there's a genuine question there for Ireland and for Irish America as to how it can maintain the kind of influence that Niall correctly alludes to in the early 90s in 5, 10, 20 years.
I want to bring Deirdre in there as someone who has had a role in the unions, also had a role in the Democrat Party, but also has had an active interest in the more contemporary part of the peace process, so really since the institutions fell and whatever. What are your own thoughts about this idea of an Irish American vote or Irish American activism?
I'm just going to sound strange, but I agree with both, actually. I mean, I do. I think that, yeah, it wouldn't have happened. I mean, it wouldn't have happened, but really it was like a handful of individuals who got involved personally and committed, and they inspired people to get more involved, to push for the peace process all those years ago. And, knowing Tom Manton and knowing how strongly he felt, and also knowing how inspired he was by the individuals who, Niall, you worked with them, you were one of them. I mean, that really was an example of people getting involved and doing what they felt was right. And amazing when people don't, when credit isn't important, how much can get done, right? But the other part is that, look, I live in a predominantly immigrant neighborhood. And I do think that even though it is only 15 to 20 of, say, Irish immigrants without good paper, right? So they're here, but I do feel that they have a commonality with the people they work with, especially on the construction sites. The individuals that they work with that are also immigrants from other countries that they work in the restaurants, there is this type of raising the floor for other immigrants and, really having a commonality of interest in immigration reform. And I think that continues. And so it's not necessarily like an Irish American bloc vote, but I do feel that the Irish America identify as this part of the immigration experience, even if they are removed from it. And I think that brings an activism and almost like a responsibility and a duty to make things better. And I think that continues. And maybe the numbers aren't like the same, but I do think that there's this commonality of interest that continues. But it doesn't mean that the individuals that are aligning with them look like them, or that are going to be identified traditionally as that Irish American back that they were in like the 60s under Kennedy. So, I mean, that's kind of how I view it. And I realize that growing up in a neighborhood where every 5 blocks is a very different country, that's just my take. That's how I feel about it.
I think that's really interesting in real sense that Ireland manages to punch above its weight always, in a sense, like just the influence politically is so much beyond the sum of its parts. I'm going to move on because, believe it or not, we've only about 20 minutes left. In the middle of the campaign, you had the sad passing of Ruth Ginsburg. And, that seemed to us here as this huge political moment that was also had a reflection on Trump in terms of how he responded to her passing and how he moved very quickly to have a nominee. Suzanne, I'm interested in your own thoughts about that in terms of really, it was that indicative of nearly the fears of everyone that such cornerstone of American democracy would be unduly influenced.
Yeah, I think getting back to what Deirdre said at the very beginning of this, like if ever you need an example of why a vote matters, it is this. Donald Trump, because he won the presidency, has now nominated and probably confirmed 3 Supreme Court justices out of 9. That's the power of the president. That is the overriding power, as I see it, of the president of the United States, because the president of the United States may only be in power for 8 years maximum, but that legacy is going to outlive him, for decades. So, this has been a real problem, I think, for Democrats going forward. I mean, the Supreme Court is a bigger debate about how justices and judges are elected in this country in some cases and appointed in other cases, and politicization of that. But like, you know, we haven't started seeing the implications of that on people's lives, on healthcare, on abortion rights, obviously, all those kind of things. So it's been huge. How it's going to play though in this election is kind of interesting, because there's two ways of looking at this. I think that people remember the Brett Kavanaugh hearings in 2018, very contentious. And the Senate Republicans still argue that they believe they maintain control of the Senate because those hearings, they kind of backfired for Democrats. That's their argument. And I think that the line in that, I remember going around reporting myself, and people in Michigan were saying to me, it's terrible how Brett Kavanaugh was treated. So I think that, you know, there was something in that. And then I think what we saw last week at the hearings, I was writing about this on Saturday, I think Democrats handled it very carefully in the Judiciary Committee, the hearing for Amy Coney Barrett. They didn't really want a rerun of Brett Kavanaugh. So what they did was, they also didn't want to look like they were targeting Amy Coney Barrett for her Catholicism, because that also backfired when Dianne Feinstein in 2017 said to Amy Coney Barrett, your Catholic dogma lives loudly within you. So of course, Republicans said, oh, you know, is there now a religion test to be on the court? So instead of doing that, they very, very cleverly focused on healthcare. Because getting back to the midterms, this is why Nancy Pelosi believes they won in the House, because they kept the bread and butter issue of healthcare in the 2018 election. So what Democrats last week said to Barrett was, what's going to happen is the Supreme Court is due to hear a key case about Obamacare, also known as the Affordable Care Act, on November the 10th, just a week after the election. So they honed in on this, and I think it's very effective, because like everywhere, you know, these are issues that really affect Americans. Obamacare has become much more popular. It's now 10 years since they introduced it. It's very sporadic about how it's applied essentially in each state. But I think that was a very clever strategy by Democrats. They know they've lost this battle. She is going to be confirmed for the election. But they decided, you know what, we might be able to get some political gains out of this and highlight the issues that are at stake. So look, in a normal time, you know, Andrée, I'd be sitting here going, this is the biggest story ever. The Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has died. But you know what, there's been so much happening with Trump getting COVID, everything else, that I think it's just becoming one of the stories in the mix, even though ironically, it's by far the most consequential aspect of Donald Trump's presidency has been his ability, look in a lot of ways, to nominate these justices.
That's really interesting. And Deirdre, you did refer to the Supreme Court in your opening remarks, particularly around labour laws. And I'm curious as to why you see that as such a central issue.
Because it is, I mean, everything Suzanne just said, three out of 9, 1/3. I mean, flip back, Friedrich was 4-4. That was a decision having to do with agents, you know, having to do with rights for unions to have dues. And then short 2 years, I guess it was later, we have a total like overturning basically of a precedent from 1977 of Janus, which has gutted in a way, I mean, not to the level that we had predicted, basically taking away the ability of a union to charge fees for providing representation for someone who doesn't want to be a member. I mean, that was from 1977. I mean, this is an activist court, and anyone, you know, they want to say that, oh, we don't want to be, they overturned. Like, it was a reversal. It wasn't a straightening out. It wasn't a clarification. It was a reversal. And, you know, oh, it wasn't in the text. I mean, this is what the questions, I have to say also, I felt like Feinstein had one of the most respectful back and forth with during the hearings. I really did feel like she held herself to a much higher standard and did a great job during the confirmation hearings. And I do think that for the most part, most of the Democrats did too. And, you know, I do think that there was a highlighting of the 20 million that are possibly going to be without healthcare in the near future if it goes the way that everyone is predicting it. But the Supreme Court is extremely important. There really weren't that many surprises from individuals who predicted what would probably happen if the face of the court changed. And I think that we should be concerned. I mean, I don't want to be like fear mongering, but that is like, there's some real fears here. And there's other cases coming down the pike that are also going to be very dangerous on the labor side. And let's be honest, the labor that's working families, healthcare is there. Everything that we care about is the same that everyone else cares about in America. but the actual rights of the worker to be able to assert their rights to protections, I mean, it's a greater concern that I think maybe was articulated or gotten across in 2016, but damn it, I think it has gotten across in 2020. So and that's what I'm hoping.
I'm curious with a related question that came up earlier as well. So you have something that's very oppositional in terms of the Supreme Court, but you have in Biden a candidate who is renowned for his bipartisanship and that is his track record. Do you think that in such a polarized climate, that having a president will make a difference to bipartisanship, and that, say, at the end of 4 years, Biden could achieve a more centre ground than what currently exists? I'll start with Niall on that.
I think, Biden needs to be very strong. The Republicans stole 2 Supreme Court seats, Merrick Garland and the one that's just appointed now, because that should have been left to the next session of Congress. And I think the big question will be Chuck Schumer of New York, who's the Senate minority leader. If he becomes Senate majority leader, if Biden becomes president, do they pack the court? Do they extend the size of the court to reflect the fact that 2 seats were stolen from them? And this is the point that needs to be gotten across, that the Republicans have acted as very bad actors in this entire Supreme Court scenario. And that rather than being bipartisan, I think Biden needs to stand up and say, we are not going to be pushed around again. We're not going to be fooled by Mitch McConnell or any of these smart tricks he pulled, saying that, oh, we can't adjudicate in the last year of Congress on picking a new judge. But, there's a strong feeling that I would share that Democrats have been way too nice for way too long.
Yeah.
And that if they come back in with a majority and Chuck Schumer is the Senate majority leader, they should go for it. They should go for an extra 2 judges on the court.
What's your own feelings on that, Niall?
Well, I have 2, as it were, separate feelings on it. One is that I think that the polarization in this country has become so pronounced that the idea of bipartisanship on an issue as important as the Supreme Court is probably a fiction, quite honestly. I mean, firstly, these are fundamental differences of views between Democrats and Republicans on issues ranging from a woman's right to choose to labor laws or the influence of corporate money. There's just a gulf dividing opinion there. And all the incentives in American politics now sort of push politicians toward the extreme, toward their own flank. That's how you raise money. That's how you get on cable news. That's how you basically attract attention to yourself. Now, the issue of adding judges to the court, I mean, I've no position personally on whether Democrats should or shouldn't. Obviously, the danger or the downside is if they do, say they add 2 justices to the Supreme Court, well, then in 4 or 8 or 12 years' time, when a Republican president is elected, does he or she add another 2? And do you get into this absurd situation of perpetual court packing? And before we know where we are, maybe not in our time, but at some point in future decades, you have a 25-member Supreme Court justice bench. That seems kind of crazy to me. I don't say that to diminish the fact that someone like Mitch McConnell, who Niall mentioned, adopted a position in the Obama presidency, which he has then shamelessly reversed in the Trump presidency. McConnell saying when Obama was president that a president could not nominate a Supreme Court justice in the last year of his term, and then McConnell virtually rubbing his hands in glee as Trump does exactly that, closer to the end of his presidency than Barack Obama was when he nominated Merrick Garland.
Yeah, I'm going to just mention one thing before we finish up, and I want to talk a little bit about gender. The last 4 years saw a president elected in a highly gendered conversation when Hillary Clinton was running against him, with some pretty fundamental issues at stake. You've subsequently seen a Me Too movement. And yet gender doesn't feature at all in this campaign from where we can sit on this side of the ocean, despite one of the vice president candidates being a woman. And I just want Suzanne and Deirdre, just if you would kind of tell us why you think that might be. Suzanne first.
Look, there's lots. I mean, I'd love to have we could have a whole separate webinar about like feminism and Hillary, I think it was too simplistic anyway, the conversation about, Hillary was going to be the first woman president and that's why women were going to vote for her. I think she's very problematic in a lot of ways, to me personally anyway, as a female role model, because, and I think this is to link to what I was about to say, I think the Me Too movement that really, came to the fore about 2 years ago, I think that would have had big problems for Bill Clinton, actually. I think it would have opened up, if the Me Too movement had happened, before the last election, I think Hillary Clinton would have had serious questions, more questions to answer about, the treatment of Monica Lewinsky, which now seems 20 on so horrendous. The kind of vilification we saw of Monica Lewinsky, the way the Democratic Party all backed, Bill Clinton at that time. So ironically, I think she had a lucky escape there, because I think it raised questions. So that's one thing. Obviously, the Joe Biden, it was interesting because early on last year when he was running the primary, there were a lot of allegations about inappropriate behavior by Biden. And that all has gone. That story never really got legs. And even though the Republicans have been trying to do such a hatchet job on Joe Biden's own family, Hunter Biden, Donald Trump, of course, showed no empathy whatsoever when Joe Biden was talking about his deceased son on stage of the debate. But now, for obvious reasons, Donald Trump doesn't want to go down the route of talking about his alleged, behavior with women, considering Donald Trump's. But you're right. I mean, I think the Me Too movement, it was peaking about a year and a half ago, but it has gone off the agenda now completely, I think. And look, there's a whole conversation. So many women did vote for Donald Trump the last time, didn't vote for Clinton. But you know what? Clinton may have the last laugh here, because the polls are suggesting that suburban middle-class women in particular are voting against Donald Trump. They're turned off him. Maybe centrist women in their 40s and 50s living in suburbs of Atlanta, of Dallas, of Houston, of Phoenix. They might sometimes vote Democrat, sometimes vote Republican. They do not like Donald Trump and his rhetoric. And that actually may cost him election. So, the women's issue might not be first and foremost in this election, but I think it actually could be one of the reasons he's going to lose it.
Deirdre, what are your own thoughts on that?
I think if women show, I think Suzanne's right. If women show up, that should go, they should go Biden. But I mean, I have to say, last time around, when I saw the numbers that went for Trump, after all the locker room talk that was put on, and I hate that term. I mean, I think that's an unacceptable classification of his comments. That was everywhere. How you could still go and not find that offensive to, I don't know how it isn't, and how it wouldn't impact your ability to vote for somebody. But it seems that I was wrong, and that a number of people were fine pulling a lever for someone who spoke in such a way, and who acted in accordance with his comments. But I do think that there it finally is, maybe an evolution, maybe a more in-depth assessment of the presidency and his policies, and a recognition that maybe this isn't a good president for a female. And I think that hopefully that there will be women showing up and voting with their conscience and how they feel. I mean, I speak to a lot of individuals who don't agree with me, to try and understand why they feel the way that they do. And the last time around, it was, yes, there was this polarizing Hillary, which seemed strange to me, but I tried to understand why they felt that way. This time around, there does seem to be, there's no anger towards Joe Biden the way that there was towards Hillary. There's no, he's really a nice person. Like, there's really not too much to go, to bring out this strong animosity towards him. So I do think that, yes, the Hunter comments, the stories that are being run, they hurt, but I don't think it's going to be enough to really turn people against Joe Biden. So we'll see. We'll see what the polls say. We'll see what everyone else says.
Well, so I mean, that's been a gallop through something that's so complex, but also has given us such rich information. I'm going to finish on a quite simple question. I'm going to ask you who you think is going to win, but I'm going to ask you, does it make a difference? What would America look like on the 4th of November if Trump wins compared to the 4th of November if Biden wins? And I'll start with Niall.
I think Biden is going to win. Now, I thought Hillary Clinton was going to win on Election Day 2016, so I put that caveat in. But I do think that Biden is going to win for various reasons that we've already discussed. If Donald Trump wins, I think that will say something profound, and this is where we started off this conversation, that will say something profound about the nature of America and the America that drew people like me in childhood or adolescence, a sort of romantic sense of America, a sense that was articulated as much maybe in popular music or cinema as much as in politics. That vision of America will die if Donald Trump is elected again. If Joe Biden is elected, it won't necessarily usher in some utopian ideal, but I think it will cast the Trump presidency as an aberration rather than an ongoing sea change.
Suzanne?
Yeah, I agree there, just to pick up on Niall's final point there. I think it's a good one. In many ways, Joe Biden is running as a kind of restoration candidate, kind of just somebody normal, as people said to me, just know what light switches are, people, no drama. And we know what we're getting because he was vice president for 8 years under Obama. But I do think, to reiterate Niall's point there, it's not going to be a return to Obama. The world has changed. There are certain things that Joe Biden, I think, will have to change on. Like, one thing we didn't get into now here is, and we're talking about labor law and issues like that. The Democratic Party have to accept that Donald Trump did tap into something about frustrations with globalization, about the limitations of free trade and how they impact certain sectors in the Midwest, like the mining, the steel industries, etc. And, I think we're going to see a tougher stance by Joe Biden on those trade issues, not quite as protectionist as Donald Trump, but, he's going to keep confronting China, I would say, for example. Now, there's a whole argument about, is that the best way to deal with China's dominance? But, on that, second thing would be foreign policy. A lot of things, again, that Donald Trump has done on the Middle East. I mean, the Palestinians feel extremely, to put it mildly, forgotten about by the US. And, is Joe Biden going to be able, like Donald Trump moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, really provocative and symbolic move. Is Joe Biden going to be able to move it back? I mean, I can't see it. So, we are where we are now, and Joe Biden, both because I think the world has changed, and because it's just difficult when you've got facts on the ground, he won't be able to go back to what it was like. So it mightn't be as much, it will be in a lot of ways, but it mightn't be the big change back that some people may have been expecting.
That's really interesting. Deirdre, what are your own thoughts on it?
So you're right. Like, we didn't go through a lot of the labor stuff, but one of the things that I feel like was not handled well was, like, right now, Samuelson is out fighting city by city, airline by airline for PPE protection for the workers, which could have been handled by the administration really easily. So there's been a consistent disappointment for looking out for workers during this very horrific time. And that, I think, will hopefully bring labor, remind them that they need to come out. I know what you were saying, Neil, about, that Biden should get tougher, but I do believe that if it is Biden, that there will be lesser polarization. And I think that both parties will get back to work to try and figure out ways to solve problems. And I think that's better for all of us. And yes, they will be fighting and they will be brawling, but at the same time, there will be a recognition that we're all in this together. And I don't think that happens under Trump. I do think that Trump, goes to the mat and doesn't have like that conversation where you bring them back to the table. And I think we need it, and we definitely need it now. And that's what I think that we will see if Biden goes in.
Do you think he will win?
Yes. I mean, God help. I mean, Look, I hope so. I mean, there's part of me that wonders, like, I don't think that we should take anything for granted. I don't think anyone should be overconfident. And I also don't think the world stops if Trump wins. I think it's awful. And honestly, Niall, your comments about, the death, you're right. And it's really sad, right? But I mean, we're resilient. We're going to come back, and Congress is really extremely important, and they're going to be there and they're going to be fighting. And we just need to keep moving forward. But I do think Biden does this. I do think, for the reasons that everyone has articulated, that he does have this political experience. He does have the ability to deal with international powers. He does have the ability, his word is good. His ability to recognize the importance of what is best for the people of the United States. And as a world citizen, I don't think he loses sight of where we are in the world and how we have a responsibility. And I think is important. And I think it resonates with the voters.
And what about yourself, Niall?
Well, I think this might be a strange thing to say. Without coronavirus, I think Trump would have won. I think he made a profound mistake. I think his economic policies, which are pretty much ignored overseas, but an awful lot of people did very well out of the Trump presidency. An awful lot of people were doing well in a booming economy. And he had the option when the coronavirus happened of putting Dr. Fauci in charge. He missed that opportunity. And that's where the election turned, in my opinion. You cannot have, unless we are a completely insane country, 250,000 people dying of a disease, deliberately mistreated by the president of the country, and then see that man re-elected. I just cannot see that. But I do honestly believe that without coronavirus, Donald Trump would have won.
That's really, really interesting and something for us all to think about. But that, unfortunately, is the end of our discussion. We've no more time left. And I know that you at home will have gained an awful lot more insights as a result of that. Probably lots more questions as well. And hopefully you can engage in the conversation on Twitter if you follow @Phobail Belfast. And I just want to thank our guests again for a very rich, diverse and important conversation that certainly keeps us informed. And we'll find out on the 4th of November. Gurmila Maigav.
I don't know if it'll be on the 4th. I think that it might be a little bit longer, but
Good
we'll see.
stuff.